The boardroom was dead silent, smelling of expensive scotch and copper. Surrounded by Chicago's most ruthless enforcers, a 7-year-old girl in a faded yellow dress marched right up to the feared syndicate boss. She pointed a tiny, trembling finger at his chest. "My mom works so hard. Why won't you pay her?" Rachel Adams sat at the small, chipped Formica kitchen table of her Logan Square apartment, staring at the slip of paper in her hands. The red stamp across the front of the check felt like a physical blow. Insufficient funds. It was the third one this month. Outside, the brutal November wind off Lake Michigan rattled the single-pane windows, but the chill, settling in Rachel's chest, had nothing to do with the weather. It had been 2 years since her husband, David, drove his Toyota Camry off an icy overpass. He had left her with a 7-year-old daughter, a broken heart, and a mountain of hidden debts that Rachel was still drowning in. To keep a roof over their heads, she worked 3 jobs. The most grueling was the graveyard shift, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans for an independent contracting agency that serviced the Silverstone building, a towering spire of mirrored glass on Michigan Avenue. She worked from midnight until 6 in the morning, making sure the executive suites were immaculate. She wiped down mahogany desks, vacuumed plush carpets, and scrubbed marble bathrooms until her knuckles bled. But for the last 3 weeks, her supervisor, a slippery man named Peter Hayes, had been giving her the runaround. First, it was a payroll glitch. Then, it was a bank holiday delay. Now, the check had outright bounced, incurring a $35 overdraft fee from Chase Bank that pushed Rachel's account into the negative. "Mommy?" Rachel quickly folded the bounced check and shoved it into her coat pocket, turning to see Lily standing in the doorway of the narrow kitchen. Her 7-year-old daughter was clutching a worn-out stuffed rabbit. Lily's breathing was shallow, a faint wheeze accompanying every exhale. "Hey, baby bug," Rachel forced a bright smile, walking over to brush a strand of brown hair out of Lily's face. She pressed the back of her hand to the little girl's forehead. No fever, but the asthma was flaring up. "My chest feels tight," Lily whispered. Rachel's heart plummeted. She went to the bathroom cabinet and shook Lily's albuterol inhaler. It was completely empty. The refill at the Walgreens on Milwaukee Avenue cost $68 out of pocket because her insurance had lapsed. Rachel had exactly $4 in her purse, and her bank account was overdrawn. The eviction notice taped to their front door 2 days ago gave them until Monday to pay the rent, or the locks would be changed. Desperation is a terrifying catalyst. It overrides logic. It overrides fear. "Get your coat on, Lily," Rachel said, her voice hardening with a resolve she didn't know she possessed. "We're going for a ride." "Where are we going?" "To Mommy's work. I need to speak to the big boss." Rachel knew Peter Hayes was just a middleman. The agency was owned by the people who owned the Silverstone building, a holding company called O'Connor Logistics. Rachel had never seen the owners. The 42nd floor, the penthouse suite, was strictly off-limits to the cleaning crew during the day. They were instructed to be invisible ghosts who cleaned in the dark. But Rachel knew the building codes. She had the key card for the service elevator. It was a Saturday morning, which meant the building would be mostly empty. But she had seen expensive black SUVs parked in the VIP underground garage on weekends before. Someone had to be up there. Someone with the authority to write her a check that wouldn't bounce. She bundled Lily into her thickest winter coat and wrapped a scarf around her mouth to protect her lungs from the biting Chicago air. They took the L train downtown, the rhythmic clack of the tracks echoing the frantic beating of Rachel's heart. She was a rule follower by nature. She was terrified of confrontation, but as she looked down at her daughter, pale and struggling to draw a full breath, the fear evaporated. It was replaced by the fierce, blinding instinct of a mother cornered. When they arrived at the Silverstone building, the sprawling granite lobby was deserted except for a single security guard dozing at the front desk. Rachel bypassed the main entrance, pulling Lily around to the loading dock in the alley. Her hands shook as she swiped her worn employee badge. A green light flashed. The heavy steel door clicked open. They stepped into the dimly lit service corridor. The smell of industrial bleach and damp cardboard was painfully familiar. "Stay close to me, Lily," Rachel whispered, squeezing her daughter's small, warm hand. "We just need to talk to someone. Get Mommy's money, and then we'll go straight to the pharmacy." "Okay, Mommy." Rachel pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The service elevator lurched upward. As the numbers above the door ticked higher, Rachel rehearsed what she would say. She would be polite but firm. She had her W-2 forms, her bounced checks, and her employment contract in her bag. She just needed them to understand. She was just a mother trying to survive. She had no idea she was riding a steel box straight into a nightmare. The service elevator dinged softly as it reached the 42nd floor. The heavy metal doors slid open, revealing the polished back hallway of the penthouse suite. Normally, when Rachel cleaned this floor at 3 a.m., it was silent, smelling of expensive leather and lemon polish. Today, it was not silent. A low, muffled sound of a man weeping echoed from the main boardroom down the hall. Rachel hesitated, her grip on Lily's hand tightening. Every instinct screamed at her to get back in the elevator and go down. But the image of the empty inhaler pushed her forward. "Just wait right here for 1 second, Lily," she whispered, motioning for her daughter to stand behind a large potted fern near the elevator bay. "Do not move." Rachel crept down the hallway, her cheap rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the imported hardwood. She reached the heavy double-oak doors of the boardroom. They were cracked open just an inch. She peered through the gap, and the breath hitched in her throat. The plush Persian rug she had vacuumed just 3 nights ago was rolled back. In its place, a thick sheet of heavy-duty translucent plastic was laid out over the mahogany floorboards. Kneeling on the plastic was Peter Hayes, her sleazy supervisor. His designer suit was torn, his face battered and bleeding heavily from a cut above his eye. He was sobbing, his hands bound behind his back with zip ties. Standing in a semicircle around him were 4 massive men in dark tailored suits. They weren't security guards. They had the cold, dead-eyed look of men who hurt people for a living. One of them casually held a suppressed handgun down at his side. But it was the man sitting at the head of the long glass conference table who commanded the room's terrifying gravity. Declan O'Connor. He didn't look like a mob boss from the movies. He looked like a ruthless Wall Street CEO. In his late 30s, with sharp, aristocratic features, piercing pale blue eyes, and dark hair lightly dusted with silver at the temples, he was dressed in a pristine charcoal 3-piece suit. He sat perfectly still, holding a crystal glass of amber liquid, watching Peter bleed with an expression of profound boredom. "I swear to God, Declan," Peter sobbed, spitting blood onto the plastic. "I didn't steal the payroll. The accounts got frozen. It was a routing error." Declan took a slow sip of his drink. When he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. It was a voice that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. "A routing error, Peter? My auditors tell me $300,000 of front company operating funds were diverted to an offshore account in the Caymans. You used the cleaner's payroll to cover your tracks. You stole from me. But worse, you drew attention to a legitimate business front." "No, please. I have a family." "So did the people whose paychecks you stole," Declan said coldly. He nodded to the man with the gun. "Finish him." Rachel gasped. She couldn't help it. The sound was tiny, but in the deadly quiet of the boardroom, it was as loud as a gunshot. Declan's blue eyes snapped instantly to the crack in the door. "Sullivan," he barked. Before Rachel could turn to run, the heavy oak doors were violently yanked open. A massive hand shot out, grabbing Rachel by the collar of her winter coat and dragging her stumbling into the room. She shrieked as she was thrown roughly onto the floor near the edge of the plastic tarp. "Look what we have here, boss." Sullivan, a hulking brute with a scarred jaw, sneered, aiming his weapon at Rachel's head. "A rat in the walls." "Please," Rachel begged, holding her hands up, her whole body shaking violently. "Please, I didn't see anything. I'm just the cleaner. I just came for my paycheck. Don't kill me." Peter Hayes looked at her, his bloody face twisting in horror. "Rachel, what the hell are you doing here?" Declan stood up slowly. He set his glass down on the table. The sheer physical presence of the man was suffocating. He walked over to where Rachel was cowering on the floor. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, calculating. "A cleaner," Declan murmured. He looked at the cheap, worn fabric of her coat, the dark circles under her terrified eyes. He recognized the desperation. He had grown up in the gutters of South Boston before building his empire in Chicago. He knew what poverty looked like, but he also knew the rules of his world. She had seen too much. "Sullivan," Declan said quietly, a death sentence hanging in the air. "Hey!" The high-pitched, furious shout shattered the tension. Everyone in the room, including the hardened killers, jolted and turned toward the doorway. Standing there was Lily. She had disobeyed her mother. She had stepped out from behind the fern. She stood in her faded yellow dress, clutching her stuffed rabbit in one hand. Her small chest was heaving with an asthma wheeze, her face pale, but her brown eyes were blazing with a fierce, protective anger. "Lily, no, run!" Rachel screamed, trying to scramble up, but Sullivan pushed her back down with a heavy boot to her shoulder. Lily didn't run. Instead, she walked straight into the room. She walked past the men with the guns. She walked past the bleeding man on the plastic tarp. She stopped mere inches away from Declan O'Connor, the most dangerous man in Chicago. She had to crane her neck straight up to look him in the eye. Declan stared down at the tiny girl, completely thrown off balance. His enforcers stood frozen, unsure of what to do with a 7-year-old intruder. Lily pointed her tiny finger right at the center of Declan's expensive vest. "My mom works so hard," Lily demanded, her voice shaking but surprisingly loud. "She cleans your yucky toilets in the dark so I can eat. She comes home crying because her hands hurt. And you took her money. Why won't you pay her?" The room went dead silent. Only the sound of Lily's wheezing breath filled the space. Declan O'Connor, a man who had stared down rival cartels and federal prosecutors without blinking, physically froze. He didn't freeze because the girl was brave. He didn't freeze because he felt pity. He froze because as he looked down at the little girl and then looked back down at the terrified mother crying on his floor, a ghost from his past slammed into him. He recognized Rachel's face. It was older, worn down by grief and exhaustion, but it was the exact same face from a photograph in a dossier that had sat on his desk 2 years ago. The wife of David Adams. David Adams, the mob accountant who had embezzled $2 million from the O'Connor syndicate, panicked and died in a fiery car crash before Declan's men could catch him, taking the location of the stolen money to his grave. The widow wasn't living on a beach in Mexico with the stolen millions. She was scrubbing his floors at midnight for minimum wage, begging for a bounced paycheck to buy her daughter medicine. Declan stared at Rachel, the pieces of a massive 2-year-old puzzle suddenly shifting in his mind. "Put the gun down, Sullivan," Declan commanded softly, never taking his eyes off Rachel. "But boss," she saw, "I said put the damn gun down." Declan's voice cracked like a whip. He slowly knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the fiercely glaring little girl. He looked at her wheezing chest, then at the terrified mother. "What is your name, little one?" Declan asked. "Lily," she said defiantly. "And you owe my mommy $412.50. Declan let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but his eyes remained stone cold as they flicked to Rachel. "I think Mrs. Adams," Declan said, using her married name and watching the shock register on Rachel's face, "that I owe your family a lot more than that." The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the ragged, whistling sound of Lily struggling to pull air into her tiny lungs. Declan O'Connor remained crouched on the floor, his pale blue eyes locked onto Rachel's terrified face. The cold, calculating monster, who had been ready to execute a man mere seconds ago, was gone, replaced by a hyper-focused predator, assessing a completely new variable. "Sullivan," Declan said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its sharp edge but demanding immediate obedience. "Yeah, boss," the hulking enforcer replied, nervously lowering his suppressed pistol. "Get Hayes out of here. Take him to the warehouse on the south side. Lock him up. We'll deal with his embezzlement later." Declan stood up, brushing a microscopic speck of dust from his knee. "And Sullivan, call Dr. Harrison. Tell him to get his medical bag and meet me in my private office. Immediately. Tell him we have a pediatric asthma flare-up. Have someone run to the pharmacy and buy every albuterol inhaler they have in stock. On it, Declan." 2 other men in suits dragged the sobbing, bleeding Peter Hayes out the side door, rolling up the heavy plastic tarp with him. Within seconds, the evidence of the brutal interrogation vanished, leaving only the scent of copper hanging in the air. Rachel was frozen, her arms wrapped protectively around Lily. She couldn't process the whiplash of the situation. The man who had just ordered a hit was now ordering asthma medication for her daughter. Declan stepped over to them and extended a large, impeccably manicured hand toward Rachel. "Get up, Mrs. Adams. The floor is no place for a lady, and your daughter needs to sit down." Rachel hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But looking into Declan's eyes, she saw a strange, immovable sincerity. She took his hand. His grip was warm and solid, pulling her to her feet with effortless strength. "Follow me," he instructed. He led them out of the boardroom and down a mahogany-paneled hallway, opening a set of heavy double doors that led into his private sanctuary. It was a sprawling office, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray, choppy waters of Lake Michigan. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a massive antique globe sat in the corner. It smelled of rich leather, old paper, and sandalwood. "Sit," he motioned to a plush, velvet sofa. Rachel sank into it, pulling Lily onto her lap. The little girl rested her head against her mother's chest, her breathing still labored. Declan walked over to a wet bar, poured a glass of water, and brought it to Rachel. "Dr. Harrison will be here in less than 10 minutes, Declan said, taking a seat in a leather armchair opposite them. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his piercing gaze studying Rachel's exhausted face. "You honestly had no idea, did you?" "Idea about what?" Rachel's voice trembled. "I just wanted my paycheck. Peter kept telling me the accounts were frozen. I didn't know what this company was." "I'm not talking about O'Connor Logistics, Rachel," Declan said softly. "I'm talking about your late husband, David." Rachel flinched at the name. David was an actuary. He worked for a corporate insurance firm downtown. He had a gambling problem. That's what the police told me when he died. They said he owed money to bad people, that he panicked and drove off the overpass because he was running. A heavy sigh escaped Declan's lips. He reached into his inside jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek silver phone, and tapped the screen. He held it out to her. On the screen was a photograph of David, but he wasn't wearing his cheap, off-the-rack suits. He was wearing a custom Italian tuxedo, standing next to Declan at what looked like a lavish gala. They were clinking champagne glasses, laughing. "David wasn't an actuary, Rachel," Declan said, his tone shockingly gentle, as if he were breaking the news of a terminal illness. "He was my chief forensic accountant. He managed the books for my entire syndicate, and he didn't have a gambling problem." The room seemed to tilt. The blood drained from Rachel's face. No, that's impossible. David was boring. He complained about spreadsheets. "We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Logan Square." "He was a master of compartmentalization," Declan corrected. "He was also a thief. 2 years ago, right before he died, David systematically dismantled a network of shell companies and transferred $2 million of my syndicate's money into a blind trust. He scrubbed the digital trail completely. Then, he ran." Rachel felt physically ill. The mountain of debt, the eviction notices, the nights she spent scrubbing toilets until her hands bled, the terror of not being able to buy Lily's medicine, all of it was while David had $2 million hidden away. "Why didn't he take us?" Rachel whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. "If he had that money, why did he leave us to rot?" "Because he knew I would hunt him to the ends of the earth," Declan stated, a cold truth in a warm room. "He knew if he took you, you would be targets. I believe he intended to secure the funds, disappear, and find a way to send for you once the dust settled. But the ice on the overpass got to him before my men could." Declan leaned back, steepling his fingers. "For 2 years, I assumed you were sitting on the cash, waiting for the statute of limitations to expire or the heat to die down. I had men watching your apartment for the first 6 months. When you started working 3 jobs, I assumed it was a brilliant cover, an act. But looking at you now," he glanced at Lily's worn-out shoes and Rachel's frayed coat. "No one is that good of an actress. You truly had no idea." The doors burst open, and an older man with a medical bag rushed in, flanked by Sullivan. "Declan, I got here as fast as I could," Dr. Harrison panted. "Tend to the girl," Declan ordered, standing up. As the doctor administered a breathing treatment to Lily, the harsh rasp in her chest slowly began to ease. Rachel watched her daughter's color return, a profound, crushing exhaustion washing over her. Her entire life for the past 2 years had been a lie built on the sins of a dead man. Declan walked over to the window, looking out over his city. When he turned back, his expression was resolved. "The eviction notice on your door," Declan said. "It's for Monday, correct?" Rachel stared at him, alarmed. "How do you know about that?" "I know everything that happens in my city," Declan replied smoothly. "You're not going back to that apartment, Rachel. You and Lily are coming with me." "What?" "No." Rachel stood up, her maternal instincts flaring again. "I'm not getting involved in the mafia. I just want my paycheck." "Your paycheck is meaningless now." Declan stepped closer, his physical presence dominating the room. "David stole from the O'Connor syndicate, but he also stole from our rivals, the Russo family. If Dominic Russo finds out David's widow is scrubbing floors in my building, he won't ask polite questions. He will torture you until you give him money you don't have, and he will use your daughter to make you talk." Rachel gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "You are stepping into my world, whether you want to or not," Declan said, his blue eyes intense, locking onto hers. "Under my roof, you will be untouchable. Lily will have the best doctors in the state. You will never scrub another floor. In exchange, you are going to help me retrace David's steps. You are going to help me find my $2 million. Within 4 hours, Rachel's life was completely rewritten. She and Lily were driven in a bulletproof Maybach to a sprawling, heavily fortified estate on the Gold Coast. The mansion was a fortress of limestone and wrought iron, surrounded by a 10-foot wall and patrolled by men who wore earpieces and carried themselves with lethal grace. They were given a suite of rooms that was larger than their entire apartment building. The bed was a cloud of Egyptian cotton. The bathroom was a temple of white marble and gold fixtures. For the first time in 2 years, Rachel didn't have to set an alarm for a midnight shift. Yet, she felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. Over the next 2 weeks, a bizarre domestic rhythm developed. Declan O'Connor, the ruthless syndicate boss, proved to be an unexpected host. He didn't lock them away. In fact, he seemed fascinated by them. He arranged for a private tutor for Lily, ensuring she didn't fall behind while she was kept out of public school for her safety. Dr. Harrison visited twice a week, placing Lily on a preventative asthma regimen that completely eradicated her wheezing. But it was the interactions between Declan and Lily that truly threw Rachel off balance. One evening, Rachel walked into the mansion's massive library to find Sullivan, the terrifying enforcer who had held a gun to her head, sitting cross-legged on a Persian rug, awkwardly coloring outside the lines in a My Little Pony coloring book, while Lily bossed him around. Sitting in a leather wingback chair nearby, reading a financial report, was Declan. He looked up as Rachel entered, a rare, genuine smirk playing on his lips. "Sullivan is struggling with the concept of magenta," Declan noted dryly. "It's a stupid color, boss," Sullivan grumbled, carefully selecting a blue crayon. "Horses ain't pink." "It's not a horse, it's a Pegasus." Lily corrected him with all the authority of a 7-year-old. Rachel couldn't help but smile, a soft, breathless sound escaping her. Declan's eyes snapped to her face, catching the genuine warmth in her expression. The air between them suddenly felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension that had been building since the day in the boardroom. Later that night, after Lily was asleep, Rachel found herself wandering down to the massive chef's kitchen for a glass of water. The house was quiet, the guards patrolling the perimeter outside. She found Declan sitting at the marble island, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking over a series of old bank statements. He was wearing a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans, stripping away the armor of his custom suits. He looked younger, tired, and undeniably handsome. "Can't sleep?" he asked, not looking up. "It's too quiet," Rachel admitted, wrapping her silk robe tighter around herself. "I'm used to the sound of the L train rattling my windows." Declan pushed a stool out for her with his foot. "Sit." She did, the proximity making her skin prickle. "I've been going over David's old files," Declan said, rubbing his temples. He was brilliant. Frustratingly so. He hid the money behind layers of encrypted accounts, but the final transfer required a physical key. a failsafe. If he died, the money would sit in purgatory forever, unless someone had the physical component to unlock the trust. And you think I have it? I think he left it with you. Declan turned to face her, his blue eyes searching hers. He knew he was in danger those last few weeks. Did he give you anything? A safety deposit box key? A string of numbers? Rachel closed her eyes, forcing herself to wade into the painful memories of her husband's last days. The man she thought she knew was a ghost, replaced by a stranger. He was paranoid, she murmured. He stopped sleeping. He was always checking the locks. But he didn't give me anything. In fact, he distanced himself from me. The only person he paid attention to was Lily. Rachel's eyes snapped open. A memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. The night before he died, Rachel gasped, her pulse quickening. He came into Lily's room. He was crying. He gave her something. Declan sat up straight, his entire demeanor sharpening into a weapon. What did he give her? Her stuffed rabbit, Rachel said, her mind racing. It's a worn-out thing she's had since she was a baby. The arm had torn off in the wash. I was going to sew it, but David insisted on doing it himself. He locked himself in his study for an hour. When he gave it back to her, he told her to promise to never, ever lose it. He said it was her magic ticket. Declan was on his feet in a second. Where is the rabbit? Upstairs. She sleeps with it. They practically ran up the grand staircase. Rachel slipped quietly into Lily's darkened bedroom. The little girl was fast asleep, her breathing deep and even. Tucked securely under her arm was the faded, lumpy stuffed rabbit. With agonizing care, Rachel gently slid the rabbit out from under Lily's arm, replacing it with a plush bear. Lily stirred, sighed, and settled back into sleep. Rachel stepped out into the hallway where Declan was waiting. She handed him the rabbit. Declan ran his thumbs over the worn fabric. He felt the left arm, the one David had sewn. His eyes widened slightly. There's something hard inside the stuffing. Using a pocket knife he produced from his jeans, Declan carefully snipped the crude, uneven stitches David had made 2 years ago. He reached into the polyester stuffing and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a dull brass key, stamped with a serial number and the logo for a private, high-security vault facility located beneath the Chicago Board of Trade building. Son of a bitch, Declan breathed, a triumphant smirk crossing his face. He hid the key to a $2 million empire inside a 7-year-old's toy. Rachel stared at the key, a profound sense of closure and betrayal washing over her. So, that's it? You have the key. You have your money. We can go? Declan looked from the key to Rachel. The triumph faded from his eyes, replaced by something much more complex. He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space. He smelled of scotch and expensive cologne. Do you really want to go back to scrubbing floors, Rachel? He asked softly, his voice a low rumble. You and Lily belong here now. Before Rachel could process the sheer gravity of his words, or the way her heart fluttered at his proximity, the mansion's silence was violently shattered. The blare of the perimeter alarms screamed through the house, a deafening, pulsing klaxon. Red emergency lights began flashing in the hallway. Seconds later, the sound of automatic gunfire erupted from the front gates, echoing like thunder against the limestone walls. Sullivan came sprinting up the stairs, an assault rifle already in his hands, his face pale with fury. "Boss," Sullivan yelled over the alarms. "It's Russo. They hit the front gate with a reinforced truck. They're inside the perimeter." Declan shoved the brass key into his pocket and grabbed Rachel by the arms, his grip bruising. The gentle host was gone. The warlord had returned. "Get Lily," Declan roared over the gunfire. Now, the Gold Coast mansion, usually a silent fortress of marble and mahogany, erupted into a war zone. Rachel didn't have time to think, only to react. She lunged into the bedroom, ripping the heavy down comforter back and hauling a groggy, terrified Lily into her arms. The little girl shrieked as the sound of shattering glass and barking automatic weapons echoed up the grand staircase. "Mommy, what's happening?" Lily cried, burying her face in Rachel's neck. "I've got you, baby bug." "I've got you," Rachel promised, her voice trembling but her grip like iron. Declan was instantly at the doorway, a matte black Glock 19 materializing in his hand. The polished, composed syndicate boss had vanished. In his place stood the ruthless survivor who had clawed his way out of South Boston's gutters. His eyes were dark, scanning the hallway with lethal calculation. "Sullivan!" Declan bellowed over the deafening roar of a shotgun blast downstairs. "Hold the main landing. Do not let them breach the second floor." "You got it, boss." Sullivan's voice roared back, followed by a sustained burst of return fire. Declan grabbed Rachel's free hand, his grip warm and unyielding. "Stay low. Step exactly where I step." He pulled them down a secondary hallway, away from the grand staircase, moving with terrifying speed. The smell of cordite and pulverized drywall filled the air. They reached the end of the corridor, where a seemingly solid oak bookshelf stood. Declan reached behind a leather-bound encyclopedia and yanked a concealed lever. The entire bookshelf swung inward, revealing a steel-reinforced passageway. He shoved Rachel and Lily inside, slamming the heavy door shut behind them. The deafening chaos of the gunfight was instantly muffled, reduced to a dull, rhythmic thudding against the foot-thick walls. They were in a state-of-the-art panic room. Emergency LED lights hummed to life, casting a sterile white glow over a bank of security monitors, medical supplies, and a steel bench. Rachel collapsed onto the bench, pulling Lily onto her lap, rocking her back and forth. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it would crack her ribs. She looked up at Declan, who was rapidly typing a sequence into a wall-mounted communication panel. "Is it Dominic Russo?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did he come for the money?" "He came for blood," Declan corrected grimly, turning to face her. "He knew my men were stretched thin monitoring the ports tonight. He took a desperate gamble to decapitate my organization." Declan walked over to her. He knelt, just as he had in the boardroom 2 weeks ago. But this time, there was no cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. There was an intense, burning vulnerability. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the dull brass key, the key to the $2 million blind trust David had died trying to hide. He took Rachel's trembling hand and pressed the cold metal into her palm, folding her fingers over it. "Declan, no," Rachel protested, trying to pull away. "I don't want it. I don't care about the money." "Listen to me," Declan said, his voice a fierce, low rumble. He reached up, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. "If I don't walk back through that door, there is a secondary egress tunnel at the back of this room. It leads to the storm drains on Astor Street. Sullivan knows where it is. He will take you to the vault beneath the Board of Trade. You take the $2 million, you take Lily, and you vanish. You hear me?" "You can't go back out there," Rachel choked out, suddenly terrified of losing this terrifying, complicated man who had given them sanctuary. "They'll kill you." A dark, dangerous smile curved Declan's lips. "I'm Declan O'Connor. Men like Dominic Russo don't kill me. They just ruin my carpets." He leaned in and pressed a firm, searing kiss to Rachel's forehead, lingering for a fraction of a second, breathing in the scent of her hair. He gave Lily's knee a gentle squeeze. "Lock the door behind me." He stepped out, and the steel bookshelf slammed shut. The deadbolts engaged with a heavy clack. Time twisted into an agonizing crawl. Rachel sat on the steel bench, her eyes glued to the muted security monitors. She watched a silent, brutal ballet unfold in the grand foyer. Declan moved like a shadow, his precision terrifying. He wasn't just defending his home. He was executing a flawless counteroffensive. Suddenly, a massive explosion shook the foundation of the house. The monitors flickered and died, plunging the panic room into blind, agonizing suspense. For 20 minutes, Rachel sat in the silence, clutching Lily, praying to a God she hadn't spoken to since David died. She looked down at the brass key in her hand. Her husband had lied to her, endangered her, and left her with a puzzle that almost got her daughter killed. He had valued this piece of metal over their lives. But the man outside? The ruthless mob boss? He was bleeding for them. Finally, the heavy mechanical clanking of the deadbolts echoed in the small space. Rachel held her breath, pulling Lily tighter against her chest. The heavy door swung open. Declan stood in the doorway. His expensive t-shirt was torn, his left arm bleeding freely from a grazing bullet wound, and a dark bruise was blooming along his jawline. But he was alive. Behind him, The house was eerily silent. "Russo?" Rachel breathed. "Handled," Declan said simply. He leaned against the doorframe, his chest heaving, his eyes locking onto hers. "It's over, Rachel. The police have been diverted. My cleaning crews are on their way. You're safe." Rachel slowly stood up, setting Lily down on the bench. She walked across the small room until she was inches away from him. She reached out, her fingers gently grazing the uninjured side of his face. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes for a brief second, allowing the armor to fully fall away. She took his hand and placed the brass key back into his palm. "Keep it," Rachel said softly, her brown eyes meeting his fierce blue ones. "I don't need a magic ticket to run away anymore. I'm exactly where I want to be." Declan looked at the key, then tossed it carelessly over his shoulder into the corner of the panic room. He didn't need David Adams's stolen money. He had already found the only treasure worth dying for. He wrapped his uninjured arm around Rachel's waist, pulling her flush against him, and finally crashed his lips down onto hers. It was a kiss forged in gunpowder and desperation, a promise of absolute, uncompromising protection. "Mommy?" Lily's small voice piped up from behind them. "Are the bad men gone?" Declan pulled back, resting his forehead against Rachel's, a genuine, breathtaking smile breaking across his bruised face. He looked over Rachel's shoulder at the little girl who had marched into his boardroom and changed his life. "Yeah, Lily," Declan said, his voice thick with a new kind of devotion. "The bad men are gone, and they are never, ever coming back." 6 months later, the Logan Square apartment was a distant nightmare. Rachel no longer scrubbed floors in the dark. She stood beside Declan O'Connor, the untouchable queen of his empire. Lily's wheezing was gone, replaced by laughter echoing through the Gold Coast mansion. A bounced paycheck had brought them into the lion's den, but a mother's fierce love had tamed the beast, forging an unbreakable family.